I now would like to introduce the speakers for our policy forum, which is a wonderful way to end our two-day conference on precarity. Let me first start with our moderator, who is Dr. Victor Rubin. Dr. Rubin is the Director of Public Policy for the California Labor Laboratory. Prior to joining the lab in this role, Dr. Rubin has had a distinguished career at the interface of research and policy, including stints as Director of Research and Community Programs at the Institute for Urban and Regional Development and Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning at UC Berkeley. He's also been Director of the Office of Community Partnerships at the Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington, and then Vice President for Research at PolicyLink in Oakland. Dr. Rubin holds a bachelor's degree from University of Chicago in Public Affairs and a master's and doctorate in City and Regional Planning from UC Berkeley. Our second moderator is Ms. Laura Stock. Laura Stock is Director of Community Engagement for the California Labor Laboratory. She is also Director of the Labor Occupational Health Program of the Northern California Center for Occupational Environmental Health. In her over 35 years at LOHP, she has developed training programs and educational materials on occupational safety and health issues, and has provided technical assistance and consultation to workers, unions, joint labor management committees, employers, policymakers, and others on how to set up comprehensive and effective health and safety programs. Ms. Stock is also governor-appointed member of the California OSHA Standards Board, charged with developing health and safety regulations for the state of California. Ms. Stock holds a bachelor's degree from Brown University in social science and a master's in public health from UC Berkeley. Our panel members today are Beth Ross, Esquire. Over the last 35 years, Ms. Ross has provided legal services to labor organizations, nonprofits, and individual working people in the fields of traditional labor and employment law. Areas of expertise include wage and hour law, independent contractor misclassification, collective bargaining, grievance handling and arbitration, sex harassment, and disability determination. She was the lead attorney in several important cases involving worker misclassification, most notably the case she won against FedEx, who claimed that their drivers were not employees. Ms. Ross holds a bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University in letters and a JD degree from the University of California, Berkeley. Our next panelist is Mr. Rene Bayardo. Mr. Bayardo, and I apologize for mispronouncing your last name. Rene Bayardo currently serves as the Director of Government Relations for SEIU California, which represents 700,000 workers. Mr. Bayardo joined SEIU California in 2011 as a legislative advocate, having previously worked as staff in the California legislature. Mr. Bayardo helped lead the fight against wage theft, including the passage of SB 588 in 2015, which gave workers stronger tools to hold employers accountable for paying stolen wages. Mr. Bayardo is a past board member of the Center for Workers' Rights, which strives to improve working conditions, reduce barriers to securing employment, and remedy workplace injustices for low-wage workers and their families in the greater Sacramento Valley. Mr. Bayardo holds a bachelor's degree from the California State University in Sacramento in political science and government. Let me turn our policy forum over to Dr. Rubin. Victor.
Thank you, Christina, and thanks to everybody who's put on such a remarkable conference already, and with a range of panels and presentations that have foreshadowed a lot of what we'll be talking about today. If there are any UC labor lawyers or New York Times fact checkers listening, I was actually an adjunct associate professor of city and regional planning at Berkeley. The IURD gig was the day job. So I don't want any misunderstanding about that, but I did teach in the department for more than a decade and greatly appreciated my time there. We're going to move things at a little faster pace, if you will, than what you've heard, rather than 45-minute blocks for one distinguished professor. We hope to hear from about 5 of us in the course of the next 45 minutes. We're doing 1 or 2 things. We have just got our last speaker on screen. So since he's going to be speaking first, that's wonderful. Welcome, Assemblymember. We'll introduce you in a moment. But just to give people a little grounding here, we've been talking about various dimensions of the design of public policies and in some cases, the assessment of policies that have been in place about precarious work challenges in all their diversity. We think about the work of the California Labor Lab as being able to influence 3 broad areas of legislation, litigation, and organizing. And we're privileged to have a speaker with vast experience in each one of those 3 areas. Legislation, every level of government, local, state, and federal. And as you can hear from what we've already talked about in the last 2 days, this is enormously eclectic. It's public health, medical care, economic development, employment law, business regulation, transportation regulation, the regulation of the information technology industry, and so forth. Litigation is about interpreting the law, establishing precedents, protecting workers' rights, signaling through cases where systemic changes are needed. And of course, organizing is taking many forms. The established labor unions are taking on issues of precarious work in new ways, as we'll hear from Rene. But there are alternative forms of labor organizing going on as well. And we heard about the National Domestic Workers Alliance yesterday as an example, and active engagement from various gig writers united and other entities. So legislation, litigation, and organizing in all respects can be influenced by good research. The research can take a lot of different forms. The Labor Lab is going to be known for a lot of its signature sample surveys where we can dig deep into the experiences of all kinds of workers. It's going to be known for the reanalysis of very large administrative data sets and health records and workplace records. And it's going to be very interested, if you will, and very prominent in promoting the narratives, the stories, the lived experience and the voice of workers individually and collectively. And we don't want to privilege any one kind of research over another. We know they're all really important. And we're going to be asking our speakers today, and as we go forward, how can this kind of research have an influence on the public square, on the making of public policy? And even in today's conversation, some of our questions will begin to set us up for that, because we have about 5 years of work to do to put that kind of research into the policymaking process as well as we can. We're going to be joined first by Assemblymember Ash Kalra, who will have to leave at the bottom of the hour at 1:30. So we're going to ask him to make his remarks first, and then we'll ask Beth Ross and Rene Bayardo to join in a panel discussion. Assemblymember Kalra represents the, pardon me, while I'm shifting my pages around here, the 27th district of the state of California in the Assembly. That's a good part of San Jose, including all of downtown. He was first elected in 2016, becoming the first Indian American to serve in the California legislature in state history. He was reelected to his 3rd term in 2020. He is formerly a city council member, and before that, a public defender. These days in the Assembly, Assemblymember Kalra is chair of the Committee on Labor and Employment, which is of direct relevance to our discussion and will probably be the basis for much of his remarks. And he's on 3 or 4 other committees as well. He's the chair of the Legislative Progressive Caucus advancing a compassionate, inclusive agenda for all Californians. I want to thank the Assembly member for joining us and making the time, and welcome him to the stage.
Well, thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to speak about the future of work and workers, and certainly the role of legislation in shaping it. And thank you for accommodating my schedule. I have to head back on the road, back to my district in San Jose soon. The capital of Silicon Valley, by the way, right? As we talk about these issues, I'm certainly in kind of the heart of it on many fronts. And when you think about the question about what the future of work looks like for workers, that question really couldn't be more pressing. And I'd certainly like to focus on the increasing role of technology in our workplaces and how employers deploy it to manage their workforce. And we've all seen this during the pandemic, how workers deemed non-essential began to work remotely. The rise in remote work meant that many employers sought new ways to manage their workforce. And some, if not most, employers turned to data-driven technology, such as computer monitoring software, to track their remote employees' every move. That includes, like, even when they say, hey, you have to have your camera on, right? That's something that we hear a lot of, making sure they know exactly where you are, to even more nefarious mechanisms as well. And also, as communities quarantined and businesses shut down, consumer demand for gig work, such as grocery delivery or Amazon fulfillment, skyrocketed. Consumers became increasingly dependent upon products and services delivered by workers managed by algorithms, phone-based apps, and production quotas. A few colleagues and I are actually working on legislation this year, working also with SEIU and others to build guardrails around technologies that substantially impact workers, such as AI, algorithms, production standards, and surveillance. You've, I'm sure, heard of a lot of those horror stories, especially in the warehouses, where because of the production standards and the surveillance that's used, that is difficult for folks to even take a bathroom break. And that same technology is used for delivery drivers. It's used, really, the applications are growing, and yet there isn't real regulation around it on the ground level that can guide employers and protect workers. This policy proposal we're working on, mirrors a key recommendation, excuse me, of the California's Future of Work Commission that was established by the governor in 2019. I served on that commission. The only other legislator to serve on it was Senator Henry Stern. But there were other electeds like our controller, Betty E. There were business folks, labor folks, academics on it as well. Excuse me. The commission's final report argues that the growth of data-driven technologies is a call to policymakers to update employment law and adopt regulations to reduce the impact on workers' well-being. This effort follows landmark legislation from last year, AB 701, which required that workers be notified of production quotas in the warehouse industry. We know that work intensification can have direct impacts on a person's physical health and mental health, for that matter. Some key points that we hope to address through legislation are: we want to see workers receive notice of each technology being used, a limit on what it can be used for, and safe practices for maintaining the data. We want to ensure that algorithms are not used alone without corroboration to make employment-related decisions, such as hiring and firing. We want to make sure that technologies that pose a higher risk of producing bias-based decisions must undergo an impact assessment with worker input. And finally, I think it's important to mention that this kind of protective legislation is critical because it recognizes the inherent power dynamic between workers and employers, and that workers, especially low-wage workers, hold little bargaining power compared to their employers. Ultimately, it's not about, saying that technology is bad. In fact, at one of the hearings on this piece of legislation, we had someone speaking about UPS. UPS is the employees, Teamsters, And so it is a labor workforce, a union workforce, and they use a lot of data as to what turns make the most sense to efficiency, for saving gas. These are all things that the workers agree with. But they make sense in terms of the business model, but they also they're not overly onerous in terms of the surveillance of the workers or controlling the workers' actions. And so it's not saying that technology is bad and shouldn't be used. It is saying that workers don't abandon their privacy rights when they step onto the place of employment. They don't abandon their ability to have self-determination of the use of technology. And more often than not, workers are probably going to agree in many cases with technology that's going to be used. And I think that collaboration makes for a better workplace, ultimately for greater productivity for the employers as well. And so when we talk about what kind of research would be helpful in supporting policy proposals that address the future of work, I think first, in terms of our work on limiting data-driven technologies in the workplace, we do need more research on how pervasive each technology is. There are a few studies on this, and there are mostly surveys done by industry association. So we can also benefit from more evidence on or anecdotes that demonstrate the way data-driven technologies harm workers. So for the academics, absolutely, those are things that we can absolutely use help on, is better data, better research, more substantive research to be done. This is a new area for all of us that I think we're learning so much more on, and that research, obviously, there certainly can be value from surveys done by industry associations, but I think academic research is what provides us a great foundation for legislation and for having these conversations, both with workers and employers. Secondly, for any legislation promoting worker health, safety, or improved working conditions, we need more quantitative evidence of how not furthering these goals creates a high cost to businesses, reduces productivity, leads to retention and recruitment problems, and hurts the state and local economies. For quite a few of my colleagues, evidence of the harm to businesses and the economy is what resonates with them. We have a broad, even amongst the Democrats, 3/4 of the legislators are Democrats, but different things resonate with us. I certainly have a big focus on worker health and safety and worker empowerment, but there are going to be folks, including some in terms of Republicans, that learning about the harm to business and economy can actually move them on some of these issues. And that's where, it sometimes seems like the short-term profit seeking of some of these measures takes precedent. But if we can show employers that, look, in the long term, you're actually hurting your bottom line, especially as it applies to retention and retraining, which is enormously costly for businesses, I think that we can find win-win opportunities with regulation, with legislation, and ultimately with companies that can work with their workforce to create an environment that's healthy, that uses technology in a healthy manner. And so those are some of my thoughts. I'm happy the few minutes I have left here to answer any questions folks might have. But again, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Laura Stock of the Labor Occupational Health Program will start off this questioning and moderate any questions we get from our viewers. And you're welcome, as you saw in the chat, to put them in the chat. Laura?
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Congressmember Kalra. That was really, really helpful. And thank you for all the work you've been doing over the last number of years to address these issues for workers. And so I wanted to, again, reiterate what everyone saw in the chat, that if you have questions, please put them in the question and answer button. We have our speaker for another 10 minutes or so. So please add them there, and we'll be checking that. But I'll start out with a couple of questions. One is just a small practical question, and the legislation that you're mentioning, does it apply to what industries does it apply to? I know, and just to say in general, I know that a lot of times people have been looking at the sort of obvious places where we know that algorithms are being used, from warehouses, et cetera. I also know that that technology has been around for many, many years, for call centers 20 years ago, where people's productivity was monitored, et cetera, in a different form. So I'm wondering, the legislation you're currently sponsoring, how broad it is and who it will be covering.
Well, it is broad. It would be broadly applicable because the reality is that these technologies, as you mentioned, maybe 5-10 years ago, they were used in very narrow industries for narrow applications. But now the technology is pervasive because pretty much every industry can take advantage of it. Now they can take advantage of it for better or for worse. And that's where the regulation comes into play. But if you think about it, whether someone's a farm worker, a delivery driver, whether they could be a software engineer working from home and have their actions and how much time they're online being tracked and what have you. And so we're seeing that regardless of the industry, the technology is being used to monitor workers. Now, again, reiterating, that's not always a bad thing, but I do think the workers should have some say in how it's being used. They should have some sense of transparency in knowing what's being used and how it impacts their job, including promotions, firing, bonuses, as well as just the basic privacy issues that every person is entitled to. So it's really, the reality is we have to look very broadly at how technology is used, because you may find an industry where maybe it's not being used too much today, but I guarantee you within the next 4 or 5 years, it will be because it's been made so readily accessible and available. And these companies are trying to squeeze every penny of productivity they can out of workers. And we want to make sure that the workers are able to benefit from that as well.
Thank you for that. And then my next question, I think I'm just going to quickly check to see when questions come in. But my next question is that I appreciate that you spoke specifically about the kind of research that's helpful in your legislative campaigns. And I'd like to broaden that out a little bit to ask you, as you're pushing forward an initiative like this, and it sounds like you've got some opposition to contend with, what are the elements that are most effective in supporting an effort like that? You've talked some about the research that you need, so that was very helpful. Do you have anything else you might add in terms of some of the participants in this conference? Some are researchers, some are workers, some represent advocacy groups or public, nonprofits or community-based organizations. What are the kinds of ways that people can be engaged in a policy campaign and support your efforts?
Yeah, every one of the stakeholders you just referred to can be helpful in different ways. We have legislation. Obviously, we want to hear from workers directly of how they're impacted, and that includes the nonprofits and community-based organizations that assist them, that help bring them voice. It's incredibly impactful to hear those voices. There's no doubt the researchers, whether it's public health entities or academic or entities, the data is the data. And what the issue that we sometimes run into is that we only get industry funded research and surveys and what have you. And of course, as you all know, data can be spun in many different ways. We need objective data from objective researchers, academics. And that allows us, because maybe I also have a perception of how a certain technology is being used, and maybe it's not as bad as I might think it is based upon the actual data of how it's being used, but it might open up our eyes as to potential applications that could be more dangerous down the road. And so the objective data, both in terms of the technologies that are being used, the impacts on both the workers and the employers, and the consumer as well. And the third thing, as I mentioned briefly previously, the economic impacts, because those are always overblown. Industry trade groups like the Chamber of Commerce, anytime you have anything that they don't like, they just call it a job killer. And even though they never back up those claims when legislation is passed 2, 3, 4 years later and say, oh, these are all the jobs we lost, because it's just it's simply a political tool to be able to label something that way. Well, I think that combating that with real data from academics is incredibly helpful, saying, this is, minimum wage increases are a perfect example. When I was in San Jose City Council, just back then, just pushing from $8 to $10, and the most of the serious academic research showed that not only would you not lose jobs, you'd probably add jobs by increasing the minimum wage. Certainly add more full-time jobs where someone can actually stay in one job and get compensated enough rather than having to cobble together 2 or 3 jobs. And so all of those different areas are incredibly helpful. And there's plenty of work to be done in this arena over the next really a couple of decades or more.
Thank you. And actually, there's a question that I want to share from Minda Aguhab. She says, thank you for your support for gig workers. I met you when I spoke at Uber last year. Are you interested or want more research straight from the frontline workers, perceptions and their data?
Absolutely. I think that getting data of the frontline workers, I mean, something just surveys on their quality of life. How many are sleeping on their cars? How many are struggling to pay rent? That's incredibly helpful data. In addition to the anecdotes, we want the stories too, right? The stories do matter. You have to personalize these issues, but the data is something that makes it very challenging to combat. If you had the raw data of this, we already know some of the struggles of gig workers that exist, especially in high cost of living areas. But especially after Prop 22, after we're seeing, even more and more restrictions on the conduct being placed by these app companies, these gig companies, I think that this is an ongoing battle, and it's being taken to other states as well. So short answer is yes, absolutely. We want the data as well as the anecdotes from those in the front line.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Victor, our moderator.
Thank you. I was very glad to hear your characterization of 2 related issues. One is documenting the high cost of inaction. And I guess that's both government costs, everything from medical care to unemployment insurance to a million other things, but also the cost to business, particularly the long-term productivity losses from rapid turnover and the costs of training and all those related things. So I guess the question is, how are the politics of business response to your proposals shaking out? We seem to be in a period where, on the one hand, there's a lot of immediate knee-jerk negative reaction of the sort you just characterized, but there's also a growing corporate and even small business sector advocating progressive approaches to public policy, advocating environmental, social, and governance reform, and being quite open to these things. How's it playing out in your particular instance?
I think to your latter point, I think that there's definitely seems to be more, but activism on the corporate side. But at the end of the day, it's still, relatively speaking, a very small number of actors that are actually vocal about social progress, environmental issues, worker issues. And the reality is that we hear very little from small businesses. Now, we had the large trade organizations always talk about mom and pop. So the reality is they're really representing the very large corporations that really fight regulation at every turn. Not just regulation, they fight just data collecting. I have a bill right now with the Controller Yi to try to get data from companies of over 1,000 people so that we can start to create an incentive program for high road employment. And they're fighting it. They're calling it a job killer. And so the reality is very different than the perception sometimes. I always talk about how, a lot of these big corporations will, depending on the time of the year, if it's February, African American History Month, they'll do ads on Black Lives Matter, what have you, but they're not hiring Black workers, right? Or they're certainly not standing up for Black workers, and so on and so forth. And so the perception is relevant, but the perception changing in a positive direction is relevant. But I think it's more because the public sentiment is demanding it. On the ground and the actual, like behind the scenes, they're still working to kill legislation and policies that uplift workers. And so the good news is that they're feeling forced to even publicly move in that direction. That's a start. And we do know the younger generation is far more in favor of unions. They're far more in favor of a move towards more government assistance and social assistance, and are recognizing the massive wealth inequality that we have in our state, in our country, is unsustainable. And so I think that these companies, the smart ones, will get ahead of the curve, and data and research that you all can do can help get them there. Because even with the bill I'm doing with the Controller E, private conversations have happened with big companies. None of them want to publicly come out and support, because they get shamed from the other corporations. And so we've got to get, we have to get that first domino to fall. And I think there's a lot more dominoes after that if we can get some of these companies to recognize that they need to be part of the solution, and that just looking at their bottom line is not going to cut it anymore with the general public.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I want to be respectful of your time, and we really appreciate that you gave us this half hour, and I know you need to leave at 1:30. So once again, thank you so much, not only for participating, but for your leadership in addressing these critical issues in the future. So again, thank you from all of us.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great, and I'll turn it back to you, Victor, to introduce our next speaker.
Yes, Christina introduced and gave a little background on both Rene and Beth, and Beth will speak first, followed by Rene, and then Laura will come back to lead a discussion with both of them and more of your comments and questions until 1/4 the next hour. The one point I made and was going to reinforce about the variety of types of research that are relevant in the public debate has been reinforced already by the Assemblymember. And as I said, we don't need to privilege big data over sample surveys or sample surveys over the narratives and stories of individual workers. And we need creativity and diversity in all of those things as we find the right ways to understand what's happening, assess what might be taking place with the innovations, and build the evidence base for moving forward. The only other point I'll make is I was thinking about how the Labor Lab is going to build a research base for policy change is just to reinforce, well, the dry term for it is data disaggregation, but basically what it means is knowing what's happening to whom. Making sure our information can be broken down by race, by gender, by age, by disability, by community of residence, whatever the relevant factors are. And we've heard from a number of our speakers in the last 2 days how important that is. And in other cases, it hasn't come up. And we've been talking about workers in general or workplaces in general. It's not a technical issue. It's actually at the heart of understanding the consequences of action, or for that matter, inaction. So for surveys, it's about oversampling oftentimes, which takes money, as Ed will always remind me, and everyone else will. And we have some good examples of where funders have stepped up and said, yes, you need to be able to disaggregate this data in a new way, and we'll increase your survey budget. It might mean that the big databases from administrative sources are tagged with identifiers. And it just might mean that when we bring the voices of workers to the forefront, we have a very broad and comprehensive representation of all their diversity. And so that's just the other sort of guiding spirit for a lot of what we'll do as we think about how we can influence the policy change process. But I'd like to invite Beth Ross, who's been one of the leading litigators in this area of employment law in general and misclassification of employees in particular, to make some remarks. You might want to react to things that the Assemblymember said, or take us in a different direction, but we're welcome to the policy forum, and the floor is yours.
Always forget to unmute on Zoom, which you don't have to do when you're speaking live at a conference. Thank you so much for inviting me to this important symposium. I've really enjoyed the talks I've been able to attend, and I'm kind of a different animal in this constellation, because I am a person who has spent my career as a litigator, and what lawyers do is they enforce law, they enforce policy objectives that other people dream up and move. But oftentimes what happens with our work is that our work kind of circles back to inform where policymakers may go next. So as the lovely introduction Christina gave indicated, I'm a labor lawyer. I've spent more than 30 years advocating on behalf of workers who were or have been misclassified as independent contractors and denied the basic employment rights that so many of us have come to know and expect from society and our employers. Low-wage workers who are employees expect to be paid minimum wages or overtime for their long hours. Unemployment insurance and workers' compensation protections are rock bottom social safety net benefits. Social Security, which is what you pay in, is what you get out when you become elderly. Not to mention the many protections that were extended to employees under the various COVID pandemic employee laws, and of course, the right to engage in form a union and engage in collective bargaining. So this afternoon, I will offer an abbreviated history of employment misclassification, a little bit of a law school lecture, if you will, along with a flavor of a few of the cases I've been involved with, and some observations about lessons that I have learned in my practice that could be of value to people, moving forward with policy in this new wild world of the future of work. So I'd start with a very basic question: who is an employee under the law and why do we care? Well, of course, if you ask non-lawyers who is an employee, they have no trouble answering the question. It's somebody who works for somebody else. It seems so obvious. What could be so hard about that? But under American law, the answer to the question is not so obvious at all. And in fact, under American law, in every jurisdiction in every state of this country, and every jurisdiction, the term employee is a term of art, and it varies depending upon the law to be applied or enforced. In California, as one example, a worker can be an employee of a private business entitled to workers' compensation coverage, but not for the protections of the workplace discrimination laws under the Fair Employment and Housing Act. Of course, there's a substantial overlap in the multiplicity of legal tests for identifying and distinguishing between who is an employee and who is not, and the legal consequences that flow from that status. And that basic legal test centers on whether the business has the right to control when, where, and how the work is done, and or to control the details of the work. And it's a test that's rooted actually in the English common law of master and servant, doctrines that were used to determine when a person who hired another, the master, could be held liable for the negligent or bad acts of the worker. So it is an economic concept who is an employee. Of course, over time, every state has developed its own variation of this legal test, principally in the tort area. And as the nature of work and industry has evolved and our society has become more increasingly complex, this right to control of details framework has been adopted and adapted in lots of ways. And in California, our iteration of this test is particularly generous to employees. Perhaps not surprisingly, the different legal tests for distinguishing between who is an employee and who is not really just reflect legislative and judicial policy judgments about legal rights, responsibilities, and entitlements of workers and those for whom they labor relative both to each other and to the outside world. So workplace regulation in this country really started with the New Deal reforms designed largely by Francis Perkins and appointed by FDR to run the DOL that remain in force to this day. The Fair Labor Standards Act that regulates hours and minimum wages and maximum hours, the NLRA, which establishes the right to organize and bargain collectively and the right to strike, as well as the comprehensive system of unemployment insurance and Social Security. And I am compelled to note the shameful history of these laws, despite all the good that they have done, which intentionally excluded occupations occupied by African American workers and other people of color to garner support from the Southern Dixiecrats in the time. The New Deal architects staked out employment as the locus of the modern social safety net and tied important social benefits to the workplace. Now, that is not necessarily true in other countries, but that is our system. This represented a vast shift in economic policy away from the failed Lochner-era laissez-faire economic policies of that preceded it, of the Gilded Age, and that preceded the Great Depression. And the explicit intent of these laws was to redistribute wealth and power to working people to create a more balanced playing field as a pathway to economic prosperity for the country as a whole. So as a consequence, and as originally enacted, the New Deal era employment laws were intended by Congress to broadly protect all working people in the covered occupations, with very few exceptions. The first iteration of the NLRA, the Wagner Act, explicitly was intended to make it possible for unions to succeed in organizing and representing workers as a means of promoting industrial peace. Our national labor policy was in favor of unions. And Congress therefore intentionally left the definition of who was an employee very, very vague, leaving it to the expert agency of freehand to determine the breadth of the statute and who it would cover. And this intent was assuredly to broadly cover all kinds of workers who in today's economy would be considered ICs, meaning people who perform services for others with their labor, and who we would normally consider to be employees as a matter of common sense. Think Uber drivers, think the platform economy. The Supreme Court recognized that the intent of these laws was to be incredibly broad in a famous case involving the Hearst newspapers, which held that newsboys who delivered newspapers were entitled to form a union and bargain collectively. Of course, the Wagner Act was wildly successful as a tool for organized labor. Large numbers of American workers joined unions and freely engaged in the right to strike, which drew a tremendous backlash from the right. And in 1948, substantial changes were made to the statute and narrowed back all kinds of parts of the law that were of benefit to unions and workers in what were called the Taft-Hartley Amendments. The little discussed Taft-Hartley Amendments included excluding 2 additional categories of workers from coverage: people who were low-level supervisors on the shop floor, who of course unions wanted in the unit, because those are the people who could walk out the door and lead the workers on strike. And there was a huge amount of discussion in the congressional debates about that. And also, they excluded independent contractors. There was no attention paid to the independent contractor exemption in the congressional debates. And this exemption was sort of planted in the legislation as a seed to grow for a later time, to give business people the opportunity to grow new forms of business that would be outside the realm of organized labor and outside the protections of the whole panoply of New Deal statutes. And the intention of the sneaky lawyers who worked that exemption into the law were really not fully realized until years later. So in the 1980s, the vast majority of work, up until the 1980s, the vast majority of workers who were misclassified as ICs were agricultural workers. And that is a phenomenon probably attributable to the fact that ag workers were excluded from the protections of all of these statutes until 1966. And the growers did not like it. And so instead of comply with the laws, they tried to turn all of their workers into independent contractors through the share farming system. But in the 1980s, for those of us who can remember it, the 1980s, for those of us who can remember it, were an extremely precarious time for American workers. Industries that created the American middle class in the 1950s and the 1960s shrank through the deep recession of the 1970s, which was followed in the 1980s by offshoring of manufacturing, deregulation of everything under the sun, and the weakening of labor movements. That was kicked off in part by the breaking of the air traffic controller strike, when 11,000 workers were fired on a single day. Many formerly middle class and frequently middle-aged white workers who were in the economy in good union jobs were left behind, and created a ready supply of labor to fill positions what the former Wage and Hour Administrator David Weil later referred to as the fissured economy. So some examples from my practice. I cut my teeth in this area of the law litigating a strip club case. We sued the Mitchell Brothers O'Farrell Theater in San Francisco after the owner of the strip club reclassified all of the dancers from being employees who earned minimum wages and tips to independent contractors who went from being paid a wage plus tips to paying a stage fee to the club and working for tips alone. It was a very straightforward wage theft case. And while it was very factually interesting and quite hard fought, it was not difficult to win legally under California's employee-friendly but complex formulation of the right to control test. I'm happy to report that the court rejected all of the theater's defenses and that we did win the case. And the case holds an important place in the arc of the fight against IC misclassification for a few reasons. One, the success in court was due in no small part to the fact that the workers self-organized against a powerful predator of a boss. They supported each other and they grew support for the case. It also received a lot of national attention because sex sells and the theories were novel. And it helped bring attention to the fact that IC misclassification is a form of wage theft that is not limited just to farm workers, but that involves a huge number of vulnerable, low-wage, marginalized workers who are very unlikely to fight. We then moved on to litigating the FedEx cases that I handled for 18 years. Not an all-time record, but pretty close. At the end of the day, the FedEx cases were an important part of a much bigger fight against misclassification of low-wage workers as ICs, but who, by virtue of their misclassification, are locked out of the social safety net and other benefits and protections intended to protect all employees from wage theft and other forms of economic exploitation. The saga of the FedEx cases is what I would call a study in the production of precarious work that was grounded in neoliberal ideology. The company was formed by former UPS executives in early 1985 who had big plans to make big money by disrupting UPS and the small package delivery market with a new model that relied on the use of increased technology, using scanners for package tracking, and an independent contractor workforce to perform the core business function of package delivery. Now remember, in this time frame, the Reagan Revolution was underway and Republicans were busy deregulating everything, including trucking. The FedEx founders knew that this was a very risky proposition legally, so they hired a white shoe tax attorney from Washington, DC, to write an IC agreement for the company that they hoped would get past the IRS. And the contract, which was modeled on long-haul trunking agreements, included recitations of IC status and self-employment, but built into it every type of control necessary to establish FedEx as their employer. At the time, the economy was recovering from a substantial recession and there were lots of people who needed jobs. So where UPS drivers and these workers who were left out of the economy stood at the ready to take these jobs, notwithstanding that they were to be classified as independent contractors, they had to buy their own trucks, they had to rent their uniforms from the company, they had to rent their scanners from the company, and they would be paid what was left over. And people took these jobs because there were no other options for them in the economy. Even if they'd wanted to go to UPS, they'd be at the bottom of the ladder at UPS. Okay, I got 2 minutes. UPS drivers start at the bottom of the ladder as package handlers. FedEx offered the opportunity for workers to start out of the gate with few, if any, barriers to entry. The FedEx model shifted the costs and risks of operating the trucking business to these workers, but it subsidized all of the startup costs. In my hundreds of interviews with the FedEx drivers over the years, I learned that the be your own boss idea that the company was selling was not a major draw at all for these early drivers. They were people who needed work and it cost them little or nothing to get into the game, and they took the jobs and then found out that it was not as easy to get out as it had been to get in. So to make a really long story short, the misclassification scheme devised by FedEx and carried on by FedEx has been continually challenged over 40 years in every possible forum in the land, and FedEx has lost most but not all of the cases and administrative actions brought against it. But it has continued on, and the reason it continued on was that it was cheaper, they had the resources to do it, and the law defining who is an employee and who is an independent contractor was very, very complex. We won our cases and we won a lot of money for the drivers, but we did not win reclassification. And the lesson that we learned in the FedEx case was that it brought a spotlight to this issue, and you could draw a straight line from what we did in bringing this issue to the fore to work done in the California legislature by Ash Kalra and Lorena Gonzalez to bring forward AB5. And with that, I would be very happy to take questions afterwards, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Beth. We really appreciate that historical overview. And yes, we're going to hold questions to after we hear from our final speaker. But please, you can start to add your questions in the question and answer box, and we will capture them. And then when we open the discussion after we hear from Rene, we'll be able to go to that. And I think now we're ready to turn it over to Rene Bayardo from SEIU. So welcome to our panel, Rene. You have the floor.
All right, thank you very much. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. My name is Rene Bayardo. I'm the Government Relations Director for SEIU California. We represent over 700,000 workers in the state. I actually had a script of things I was going to say, and I'm just going to throw it out. There have been a lot of the interesting things I think that have already been said, and maybe I'll just touch upon some of those and try and focus a little bit on the organizing components. One of the things that Victor said when he was talking about understanding who is impacted by a policy, I think that that's always really important. I think that that's actually a thread that you'll see through the three industries that I talk about. So for us, like understanding who our workers are and who is impacted, our workers, our members are majority, they're women, they're Black, they're brown. So they're basically people of color. Generally, we're trying not to say any more low wage workers. Our organization is trying to shift to like workers in low wage industries because we actually think that their work is more valuable than that. But they're what people, have historically kind of categorized as low wage workers. I think that, what's interesting about that and trying to understand like who is impacted is that it's usually the same people. So I'm going to talk about janitors and kind of where we've got a success story, and then talk about fast food and nursing homes where we're trying to make some advances there. But it's the same people, like they're women, they're Black and brown. It's always the same thing. Like if you're an immigrant in this state or in this country, like that means that you're, especially if you're undocumented, then you're going to be far more likely to experience wage theft than other workers. And one of the best things that you could do to fight against wage theft is to actually have a union that can be there and advocate for you. So organizing these workers is one of the best things that we could do to fight back. We always need more enforcement, of course, but I think that, having that worker voice in some form, either a traditional union or a new type of organization, I think is critical to making sure that we're able to lift up these voices and improve working conditions. As far as, the research needs, I think there's a couple of actually really good examples of that relate to the work that we've done as an organization on wage theft. So one is just, I would point out that like 20 years ago, like if you do a LexisNexis, you're not going to get a lot of hits on wage theft 20 years ago. There was a report that like UCLA put out in 2010, and maybe like the 5 years after that, before that's really when it started hitting. I know people like Annette Bernhardt at the Berkeley Labor Center did a lot of research on wage theft, but you started to see that term show up. It used to be wage and hour violations before that. Wage and hour violations doesn't resonate. So actually like those years of research and the years of writing, if like only one thing, just like coining wage theft and really pointing out to people that like, hey, this is actually a crime. Like actually somebody was owed money and they weren't paid it. That's very different than like a wage and hour violation. And it really sets it up different. So I think like coining that is critical. So I think the research can play a critical role in that. I would also say like that report in 2010 that Victor worked on at UCLA, they pointed out that like 87% of people, so if you win a wage claim, 87% of those workers actually never see any of it. And then people will go, whoa, legislators go, that's shocking. Like I can't believe that. I can't believe that we have a system where someone goes through the process, they win, and then they get absolutely zero. Like that's fundamentally wrong. Why is this happening? And then we talked about, well, it's happening because part of the reason it's happening, right? And Beth would know about this, but it's just the changing. So people doing business as. So it's like I'm Joe's coffee shop, but that's not actually the name, right? So then I just changed the paperwork regularly to avoid liability. And SB 588, we were able to get the individual liability. So for Rene Bayardo committed wage theft, you can actually put my name on that wage claim, and it doesn't matter if I try and change the company configuration. Like I, as an individual, I'm going to be responsible for that wage theft. And I think that that's really important. But all of that all comes from research. Like we wouldn't get that bill done if there weren't researchers working on it, if there weren't researchers coining wage theft, if there weren't that research that said 87% of the people surveyed never got a penny in LA County. So all of that is really critical. And I wasn't going to say any of this, but the discussion that's already occurred kind of got me going on that. I think that beyond that, I want to just talk about some of our industries and kind of the work that we've done in organizing workers. I think one example of an area that's been, really successful is janitors. So we were told, that janitors couldn't be organized, that it was just a completely disaggregated industry, and that, talk about precarity of work, right? So like it's a precarious work condition to be Black and brown, right? To be an immigrant, to be undocumented is precarious. And kind of, people told us, this isn't going to work. You're never going to be able to organize them. But those workers wanted to be organized, and they fought for it. And actually, in many cases, they actually fought for it. Like there's an example during that process where Mike Garcia, who's passed away now, but he was the former president of SEIU USWW, he actually got punched while they were trying to organize in the Bay Area. And it was all over the news. And like that type of thing, like actually being in a fight and like taking the fight to the streets and taking the fight to the bosses actually helped change the dynamics to where they now are organized, and to where a janitor who is non-union in this state, in this country, probably is getting paid cash and probably isn't getting paid the minimum wage. Whereas one of our union janitors is making far above the minimum wage. They have family health care. And recently in the last cycle, they were able to actually get a pension. So they're actually going a different direction than other workers, where people are losing pensions and losing rights. And these workers, because they've organized, have been able to gain those rights. So I think that the janitors are a good example of like where this can be successful. One example of precarious work conditions for them, or we've done legislative work also, is around sexual harassment and sexual violence in the workplace. So janitors are in buildings often alone. Sometimes there are people in the buildings, they're strangers, or maybe a coworker at a time that is the violator, but or the aggressor. But they have had to deal with sexual harassment and violence against themselves for years. And we've done things to help with that. So now there's a standard in the industry where they have to get training, and we actually did it toward the training. It's been a little bit on hold because of the pandemic, but it's going to be through Promotora. So it's actually going to be peers training them, someone that actually has the cultural competency, actually has done the job, actually understands the experience that they're in, to be able to train them about what their rights and how they can report these things and push back on it. And we're trying to create a culture change in that industry. So I wanted to lift that up, but that's all part of like the organizing conversation. In addition to that, we're also working with the Fight for 15, which I think people are probably aware of. We've been doing it for almost a decade now. On January 1st, the minimum wage is going to go up. The governor announced due to inflation. And because of the language that was in SB 3 that we helped pass in 2016, the minimum wage on January 1 will go up to $15.50, where it's $15 now. That's an example where these workers were out organizing. They've been fighting for that $15 and fighting for the union. And that's where we see tangible results of that organizing actually turning in the real life policy that doesn't just help them, but it helps all workers. I'm sorry, I need to take a drink real quick. And then I'll talk about kind of the organizing kind of going forward and some of the ideas that we're trying to work on, right? Which is that, so we've seen really, I guess I don't have a lot of time left, but we've seen these conditions, right, in both the nursing home industry and Fight for 15, where there's like during the pandemic, there wasn't enough PPE, that the employers really didn't care to provide it, that they didn't seem all that interested in addressing the really dangerous work conditions in these areas. We saw like in fast food, workers getting like diapers instead of PPE and just kind of like crazy stuff that was occurring. So we're trying to address it. And the way that we want to address it is by creating like industry councils in both the nursing homes and the fast food industry to create an area for worker voice. So in the fast food industry, it's really important because there's actually 3 parties involved. It's not just the employer and the worker. There's actually the McDonald's, the Burger King, the Taco Bell Corporation that are some of the most powerful corporations in the world and that dictate all of the terms to that franchisee, to where the franchisee has very little control over anything. They have to use the vendors that they say that, by the way, they're also getting rebates or kickbacks on. And there's just not a lot left over for the worker. So we think that moving forward, that there should be an industry council where we could sit down and have a conversation with the workers so that they could talk about all the workplace safety issues that they're seeing and experiencing. Like, for example, recently there was a death in LA County where someone was trying to pass off forfeit money and it resulted in the Taco Bell worker actually being shot. And there are some things in the workplace that just need to be talked about. Like if you're in certain neighborhoods, maybe there needs to be security. If the corporation is mandating that you're open 24 hours, if they're mandating that you're open to 2 a.m., then we think that the corporation should be all responsible for that and make sure that the workers are safe in the workplace. But we think that, you know, that's one idea that we have of creating industry councils that could talk about specific items that are happening in the industry to try and elevate the standards, wages and health and safety standards as well. And we think that obviously like organizing is a major component of that. And the most powerful thing that we really have are the workers and are their voices and trying to give them areas where they can get in and kind of organize and express, you know, what they need to improve their working conditions. So I think I'll stop there. I said a lot, maybe too much, and I'll answer questions.
That was great, Rene. Thank you so much. And it was perfect amount of time, definitely not too much. We're going to open it up now to discussion. We have a question or two. I wanted to just reiterate how exciting it was to have representatives from all of the different ways that you can make policy change, from Congressmember Kalra to Beth Ross, who's been taking, you know, the lead in fighting these battles litigating these battles, and the work that you've been doing, Rene, as part of SEIU. And I specifically, I know you've mentioned the important role of research, and I think you've really demonstrated that equally important is the role of unions and other organizations that can elevate the issues and the concerns of workers so that they can really drive policy campaigns. So we're really lucky to have all 3 of you with us this afternoon. And now we want to kind of discuss more in general, step back and see what do we need to really make the changes that we have learned through the 2 days of this conference that we need to change. So I'm going to start by the first question that appeared in our question and answer and encourage others to add more. So this question is for Beth. What do you think is the most critically important support or legislation to obtain to win real rights for independent contractors and to fight wage theft? So Beth, maybe I'll.
That's a really big question. You know, if that question had been posed, you know, in 2018, I think, you know, everyone here and, you know, all of us would have said, well, AB 5, you know, the statute that that was sponsored by Lorena Gonzalez, who's now at the Cal Labor Fed, and that, you know, everybody, you know, the labor movements, worker advocates, everybody, you know, kind of went up to Sacramento and we worked hard and we lobbied, and somehow Gavin Newsom signed it. And, you know, things were looking pretty good because what AB 5 did was it said, who is an employee? An employee are people who you think are employees, people who perform the core business function of a business. That's who employees are. So a FedEx driver who drives the truck, and FedEx is in the business of delivering packages, and that driver delivers the packages, they're employees. And, you know, I continue to think that enforcement of AB 5 in the sectors of the California economy, where that have been left after the passage of Prop 22. Rigorous and vigorous enforcement of AB 5 is really the answer, because many independent contractors are truly misclassified, especially those who work in low-wage industries. I thank you, Rene, for pointing that out. That's such a good way to talk about the dignity of workers, and who they are is not what they do. Vis-a-vis the gig economies and the platform world, we are in a fight to the end to see if Prop 22, which took the workers employed by 5 gig companies, Uber, Lyft, Instacart, somebody can help me out here, the food and the package delivery people, food and the rideshare people, out of AB 5, that's another story. There is litigation underway to knock Prop 22 out on a kind of a technical legal theory that may well be successful. It was successful in the trial court, and we're going to wait to see what the appellate court does. But I think, in a more broad sense, there's sort of 2 ways that we can go as a society, to address this very problematic problem. One would be either to push legislation to really strengthen the New Deal reforms and bring those reforms back to life, in even more robust terms, which might be very hard to do. Or, we can sort of think as a society in a new direction down the road to really breaking the link between employment and, our social welfare contract, between all of us as a society. So if healthcare were not tied to employment, if unemployment insurance were not tied, if the entitlements that are so tied to our employment through the social safety net were provided to us as members of society in another way, then the incentives for companies like FedEx and Uber and Lyft and Instacart to draw these fine lines to make a buck for themselves would really be removed. So I think those are kind of 2 ways of thinking about this, and it's really important that we're about this now, because the people who brought us Prop 22 have their sights set on other industries. They are looking at the healthcare sector. They're looking at restaurant kitchens and room cleaners. I do work for the hotel workers. Our industry is, totally on the firing line. So this is a time to be thinking about those things, and it's, one or the other.
Great, thank you so much, Beth. We have a couple of other questions for Rene. First is, do you see workers being more motivated to organize around health and safety issues now? Or do you think this will take a back seat to wages, et cetera, as COVID hopefully fades? So yeah, any comments on sort of, people's energy around health and safety since the COVID pandemic?
I think that there is energy around health and safety. I think that as we do like the Fight for 15, the organizing that they do, because like violence, I think people have seen, stories of like, violence in like parking lots or inside the stores or things like that. So I think that those workers are really concerned about it. I do think though, especially now in the economy with inflation the way it is, and we're like, a major issue, something that's becoming a major issue for all of our locals, or I think has been for a while, but it's being elevated, is actually housing, because like whatever we bargain, their workers are losing more like in rent. Like we're having a hard time keeping up there. So I think that, it's hard to imagine that like wages won't always be one of the most important things. So I think that it's a, an and situation. So I think it's got to be both. But I think that in order to organize, I think that wages has to be a part of the campaign, and it has to be a part of, like, as we build up these sector councils, I think that the wages needs to be a part of it, because that's an area that can really energize workers and really get them out to the hearings, to the streets, and really organize around it. But I think that it's both.
Right, and thank you. And just a comment on that. I know a lot of times people have thought of health and safety as very siloed and very technical. And I think what we've learned, over the last couple of years is how broad that is, that actually having a healthy job includes not only safe working conditions, but decent wages, health care, freedom from harassment, sexual harassment, et cetera. So it's been a really important opportunity to link all these issues together. Another question for you, Rene. How has it been for SEIU to collaborate with driver-led organizations such as Rideshare Drivers United to develop the understanding of frontline workers' real needs and perspective, particularly for new immigrant workers?
I think that in all areas, like it's always, you have to talk to the workers. So for us, at least here at the state level, like we try and be really like, work from the ground up. So it's kind of like, the members are the ones that actually know what's going on. Like a janitor knows what's going on in the building. They see things, they talk to people, they're aware of what's going on. Like usually the worker, knows more about what's going on than even the CEO does. So we think that worker voice is critical to anything that we do. So anything around gig, like having worker voice is absolutely critical. I know our locals that are generally involved with those campaigns are 7 to 1 and 10 to 1, and they definitely have direct efforts where they're speaking directly to workers about the conditions that they're facing. And I think that you're absolutely right. Like it is an immigrant workforce as well. And I think that it's important to make sure that you're talking to people and that you have people that are culturally competent having those conversations as well. But yes, that of course is really important.
Great. And another question I'll pose while we're waiting for others is just asking, and this can be for Rene or Beth, or both of you, is thinking about what we heard from the Congress member about the whole move towards data-driven algorithms and how it's turning up in every occupation and industry, not just the ones that we're used to thinking about. So I'm wondering, I guess the question for you, Rene, would be is how, where you see some of those issues showing up in the workplaces that you represent, and then also Beth, do you see that as an area that you can imagine there's going to be future litigation, and how that might play out in your arena? So I don't know, Rene, if you want to start, and then Beth, if you had anything you wanted to add afterward. And you're muted, Rene.
Sorry, I was muted. So we are working with Kalra on that, and it is a priority for us. I think that there are different workplaces and there are different things going on. And I think that some of the monitoring that you see like at Amazon, where Kalra was talking about, where it's kind of like, people not even getting the time to use the restroom and things like that, where everything's just algorithm. And I think that, what we hear a lot of times is that kind of like the cat's out of the box on all this stuff, but we refuse to agree with that. And we think that in particular for us, like we want to make sure that monitoring, that we have to do something around monitoring. Like we have to do something around the selling of data. We have to do something like if an employer says, hey, download this app and we'll do your payroll this way. And if that app is tracking you when you're not at work because they know that you're at the union hall or things like that, we got to make sure that that's not happening. We have to make sure that the employer is not monetizing workers either to sell their data. So we're really concerned about all of it. It is technical. So I think that that's an area, because I know we're talking about research, but like that's, and we are connected in the researchers, but that's a really technical space. And it's an area where we have to rely on partners to provide a lot of the information, because we're obviously not experts in like algorithms and all the technology.
Okay, thank you. And Beth, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, I would add to that the work that Kalra and his partners in labor and other communities on AI and surveillance and data collection is critical. It is the issue of the hour, because this is stuff that's moving very fast, and I think there will be a litigation explosion. And given that the federal courts and the U.S. Supreme Court are increasingly not our friends, and with the overruling of Roe v. Wade and all the constitutional ground underneath it, on the federal level, says to me that the only place that that these issues can effectively be addressed is at the state level. And like many people say, as goes California, so goes the country. And so I think we're going to see this across sectors. We're going to see it in agriculture. We're going to see it anywhere, where production can be monitored. We're going to see it more and more on the docks. We're going to see it in all of the service industries. We're going to see it in hotels. Any place you can swipe, any place there's biometric data that can be gathered. Following people around to the union hall, following people into their homes to, see when their phones are on and when they're off, and, the whole gamut. This is really, really important. We're going to see litigation in every area of employment law on these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. And I think it's another opportunity for California to be in the forefront, where we often are. As it was mentioned, I'm on the Cal OSHA Standards Board, and we've been able to go further than federal OSHA. So that's just one example where, and we've certainly seen statements of, in regards to other things that are happening nationally and where California can move forward. So it's exciting to have all of these representatives advocating for these kinds of changes in the state. So I'm going to give the last question. We're running at the end of our panel to Victor. I think you had a question you'd like to pose.
Thank you, and thank you both. Rene, you mentioned nursing homes and organizing there, but didn't have a chance to get back to it. So in light of all the different cross currents we've been talking about, from bad employer behavior to the challenges of organizing immigrant workforce, what's a quick take on how the nursing home sector looks? We heard from the National Domestic Workers Alliance yesterday, which had a lot of parallels, but of course they're mainly focused on home-based care. What are the main things for this audience to take away about the nursing home industry?
Well, in the nursing home industry, so it's not, again, like they're not low wage workers, but like workers in this industry receive low wages, and and it's a problem. I think it's a problem for the workers, obviously, and trying to keep up in this economy. It's a problem for the care that people are receiving in the nursing homes, because it's an industry with a lot of churn. So people are coming in, if you're making minimum wage and you're doing a tough job, and then you experience everything that they experienced during the pandemic, where we saw like these huge outbreaks where they don't have PPE, where people that they've been caring for months, in some cases years, they're watching them pass away on what seems like almost like daily occurrences for a while. Like it was a very difficult situation, and remains to be one. And I think that it's just an industry where we have to stabilize it. Like we have to get better standards, better wages, so that we can stabilize the workforce and make sure that there's some continuity of care for the people that are receiving the care in the industry.
And are you getting traction with some major employers and major work?
I think so. I mean, the employers actually put out their own proposal for a wage increase. So I think that they recognize the need for it. I think the good thing in nursing homes is that there's a mix, right, of like, it's a little bit of state, but then mostly federal funding. So there are some opportunities there where you're able, which is a little bit different than some of the other industries, where you're able to leverage some federal funding. So we're hopeful that, there could be some opportunities where we can push to increase the standards.
Okay, well, I think we're at the end of our time now, and I want to be able to leave time for our conference organizers, Ed and Christina, to wrap up. But I wanted to just thank you all tremendously for, it was an excellent panel. It really showed, all of the different ways that we can actually affect change and what's needed to make those efforts successful. And I thank you all for the leadership that you've shown in the arenas that you're working, and look forward to hope that the California Labor Lab, as we go forward, it's obviously it's a research lab as well, but it also is, we're going to be promoting outreach and education and organizing, and we look forward to working with all of you to be sure that what comes out of this center can really have an impact on the people who really are being impacted by the changing nature of work. So thank you so much for your time. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ed and Christina.
Great. So much to chew on. This was a fantastic session. And in the Labor Lab, we promise to solve all these issues by the next time we get together for our annual conference, and to put ourselves out of business. That would be the goal.